Welcome to Authentically Debz, my podcast. A Southern girl looks at 70. All right. I have arrived in San Francisco with Patrick, but now I have to make a slight U-turn and then an even bigger U-turn because I have to take you back to Denver, something that I forgot to mention, which wasn't earth-shattering, but it was kind of jarring for me. Patrick owned a condo in that beautiful high-rise in Denver. Patrick also owned a Rolls Royce. So when he left me in Denver for that week, he left me with that Rolls Royce. And that's what I drove around. I can't believe I even forgot to mention it because I'd never driven a Rolls before. It was rather novel for me, and I certainly enjoyed it. What Patrick didn't tell me was that he also had an ex-wife in Denver who also lived in the same high-rise with her own condo, and that they shared that Rolls Royce. I don't know if that's the way they left it with their divorce. I frankly never asked, but I definitely let him know that I did not appreciate what happened. So now we're in Denver. Patrick is in town. I think I go to the grocery or something, and so I take the Rolls. And I go in the grocery, I get whatever I need. I come out and I get into my car, and as soon as I'm pulled out of the grocery or market parking lot, I notice there's a cop car behind me. And I noticed that whenever I turn, and it was a female cop, she turned also. And I thought, oh dear, have I done something wrong? Something wrong with the headlights? Does the car need... I was just like, I didn't drive a Rolls Royce every day of my life, so this was novel enough, especially with a cop following me. So she didn't put her siren on. She didn't try to stop me or anything. She just simply followed me to the high-rise where Patrick lived. And when I entered the parking structure, she followed me in there as well. After I parked the Rolls and got out, she had stopped her car and she got out too. And I just said, oh, hello. And she said, she asked me for my name. I told her. And she asked me, could she see my identification? And, I see on TV all the time where people say, why are you asking me? Why did you stop me? Why do I have to show you my ID? But, little old me, I just whipped that driver's license out for her to see. She said, okay. And she said, who are you visiting here? And I told her. And she said, is he here? And I said, yes, he is. And so we proceeded to take the elevator upstairs. He had one of the condos on one of the higher floors, which made it especially beautiful looking over the park. And when we got there, I think I had a key to the condo, but he let me in anyway. And there was this female cop in uniform. And she said it had been brought to her attention by, and I don't remember his ex-wife's name, even her first name, but it had been brought to her attention by his ex-wife that someone was driving their car other than Patrick. And he said, oh, I don't know what he said, but he made it all right. And what I remember the officer saying was that basically, like Rodney King, can't we all get along? And I thought, well, yeah, we certainly can get along, but I'm certainly not driving that Rolls Royce again. So that happened. That was kind of unfortunate, Like I say, it wasn't earth-shattering, but it wasn't a pleasant memory either. Now I want to make an even further U-turn way back to when I was living. I must have been like maybe 8 years old in Haynesville, Louisiana. Remember, I was born in Shreveport, and but was raised until I was a little older than that in Haynesville. And I had already told you that I lived with my maternal grandmother and my mother because my parents divorced when I was, I think, 2. But I was living, happily there. What I didn't mention that was one thing, this is not even jarring. This is not even necessarily negative, but this was just something that was kind of a cool memory. My grandmother rented one of her bedrooms out to a lady. I guess the lady was probably in her 70s, silver-haired. She was also a very petite lady. She wore these little, what I call sawed-off heels, always wore a dress and makeup, really short, permed hair. That was kind of the thing back then for adults, especially older adults. And her name was Katie Ruth Hogue. Now, Katie Ruth was sweet. I mean, I just considered her part of the family. I didn't remember when she had not been there. My grandmother liked her. She usually ate with us, not all the time. I don't remember her being there for Sunday dinners, but she may have been part of the time. But I do remember that everyone liked her. My maternal aunt, so I think I mentioned briefly, 3 of them lived in Haynesville too, and they would come over every day and have coffee with my mother and grandmother and various women in town. It was just, that's what you did in the afternoon. You had coffee between 2 and 4, usually closer to 4. So Katie Ruth lived there with us. She had a car. Boy, you should have seen the cars back then. They were Fords and Chevrolets, and they were old. I can see them now. They were cool, too. Anyway, Katie Ruth didn't have a regular day job. Like my mom was a teacher. My grandmother was, I don't know if my grandmother ever worked, but she was certainly not working when I was living there. She was older. Katie Ruth, I remember sometimes she would go spend the night with older people. And I was told by my mom that that's just what she did to help them. And looking back, I'm sure she got paid for doing that sometimes. She didn't do that all the time, but she did that frequently. I was getting a little older, and I remember going to the door one day. Somebody was knocking at the front door or the side door, and I would go to the door and say, hi, and it was an African-American person, and it was usually a man. And the man was usually maybe in his 30s because I was so young. Maybe that seemed old to me at the time, but definitely 30s, maybe 40s, maybe even older. It was usually men. I think there were some ladies, but mostly men. But so I would notice that they would ask to speak to Miss Katie Ruth, and or is Miss Katie Ruth there? And I said, yes, she is. And I would go get her, and she would go to the door and talk to the person, and maybe not more than 5 minutes, and then the person would leave, and she'd just go on about her life. She'd go back upstairs where her room was or do whatever else she did in our house. I began to get a little curious about this because it would seem that almost every day, at least every other day, a black person would come to our door and wanted to see Katie Ruth. And I thought, what is going on here? So this must have been in the spring or summer because someone came to the front door again. It was an African-American gentleman, and he asked, could he speak to Miss Katie Ruth? And I said, sure. And I went after her. This time, however, when she went to the door and was talking to him right outside the door, I sat on the sofa and the windows were open. We didn't have air conditioner then, except in my grandmother's bedroom. But we had a big old ceiling, not a big old ceiling fan, we had a big old attic fan. But anyway, it was summer, so I could hear what was going on, as well as I could see through the sheer curtains. And what was happening was a business transaction. Katie Ruth was loaning money to this person, or, as it turned out, because I watched more than once, she was receiving money from the person. I guess a payback of the loan. I have no idea what her rules of engagement were, what she charged as interest, but I'm sure she charged something. And I remember the coolest part of it was when she always took her handbag with her when she would talk to these people. And inside her handbag, she would get out what is a wallet, but we would call it a billfold. And she'd get that billfold out, and that billfold was bulging with cash. I'd never seen so many paper money. I just never seen that much money in one place and in one billfold. She had lots of money to loan. Now, looking back, it could have all been dollar bills. It could have been 5, 10. I'm not sure. But, man, she had a lot of money, I thought. So that's what it was. Now, I kind of figured out that she would let them borrow money, and I thought, well, that's really nice of her. And then I would see them come back and give her the money back. So I kind of began to figure out kind of sort of what was happening. And, of course, Katie never knew I was watching or listening. But one day I had one of my cousins or another friend, I can't remember. I had cousins that were my age, and I had friends. The cool thing, or the unusual thing about all of my friends and cousins, was that they were also only children. And some of them were adopted. That was just kind of strange. They were all only children. But anyway, getting back to this, I had a friend over, and I was telling her that, and she knew Katie Ruth also. I said, Katie Ruth has a billfold full of money. I've never seen that much money in a billfold. It is so fat and bulging with money, with dollar bills or maybe even $5 bills. And she said, oh, sure, And I said, no, it's true. I said, she has so much money that these people come to the house and she gives them some of it. And then sometimes they come back and give her money. So basically my friend or my cousin said, prove it. So Katie Ruth was in the house because her car was there. And I knew she was in the house. And that's the only reason I knew her purse was in the house. She was in my grandmother's room. And again, it was probably summer. My grandmother's room had the air conditioning, so it was cool. So we snuck upstairs into Katie Ruth's bedroom, and there was her purse on the table in her bedroom. And we opened that handbag, and I reached in and got that billfold, that wallet out, and it was heavy with cash, with paper money. And my friend, God, she couldn't believe it either. There was so much money in there. We were really tempted to try to count it, but I didn't want to get caught, and I didn't get caught. But that was just, looking back, that was an amazing thing to me, that little old Katie Ruth had all this money. Okay, that's enough. Now we're back in San Francisco, and we were staying at the Hyatt, and I had just run into Diane Feinstein at the salon at the Hyatt. And after about 6 weeks of staying at the Hyatt, I like to call it Home Sweet Hyatt. I thought that was kind of catchy, and I even thought that was a great trademark name and one that I had not heard used before, but I never got anywhere with it commercially. C'est la vie. I still think it's cool. But after life at the Hyatt, we next moved into a lovely rental. It was a condo, or actually part of a duplex, in San Francisco's famous Cow Hollow neighborhood near the historic Presidio. And this was near what was called Union Street. It was a very nice part of San Francisco. And by the way, San Francisco, in my opinion, is the most beautiful city in this country. Easily one of the most beautiful cities in the world, probably. But since I haven't seen that much of the world, I can't really say that with any degree of certainty. I haven't even been to every state. But shall I say the big cities that I have been to or even lived in the United States, San Francisco is by far the most beautiful, the most spectacular. So we moved into this gorgeous condo, and it was gorgeous partially because of where it was located. The Presidio was an old military base. I'm not even sure what they used it for at that point. Maybe they did still have some military there. But we also overlooked the Palace of Fine Arts, which was a beautiful building in a beautiful gardened area with, I guess you would call them ponds, but they had swans in them. And from our balcony, you could see the Golden Gate Bridge. I mean, life just didn't get much better scenery-wise than there. I really thought for a moment I was living in paradise. Although San Francisco, my only problem with San Francisco, well, it's not true. It wasn't my only problem. But San Francisco was just too cold for me. Some famous person had something to say about how cold it was in San Francisco in the summer, and it was often. It could be sunny and very cold. It could be overcast and very cold. It was always, people, the few people who were locals, and there were not many of them, and boy, those people thought their shit did not stink. If you were a local, you were, well, wow. But not only locals, but some people really liked that weather. It rarely got above 60, and it rarely got below 40, but that was just a little too cool for my taste. I preferred Los Angeles weather. So we're in this great condo. Right now we're just renting it. Patrick was rarely home. He was always traveling, usually to New York, so I was told, and sometimes overseas as well. Again, so I was told. I think Patrick had lived various places in the city, had maybe bought some of them, and this was just a new place for him. And he was thinking of buying this too. Myself, being the dreamy Pisces that I was then, took the opportunity to jog daily down near the marina. In addition to being near the Palace of Fine Arts, the Presidio, and a view of the Golden Gate Bridge, we were very near the beautiful marina where they had lovely boats and lovely running paths. And so I did that almost every day. Then I would have breakfast or brunch at my new fave bookstore, cafe combo. And I also continued my study of acting there that I had started in New York City. In fact, San Francisco was a wonderful place for training as an actor, I found, especially in the theater. Really, I did more work as an actor there than anywhere, but it was theatrical work. First, I studied with the acclaimed Jean Shelton, a scene study class near Union Square, not far from the Hyatt where we initially lived. She was more like Stella Adler than the Lee Strasberg method acting that I was studying in New York. I much preferred that. At this point, I didn't know anything about Sanford Meisner's technique yet. But then a little bit later, and I'm not even sure why or how it happened, but I also started studying with a man named Steven. He was a local director, producer, a coach at that time, and I'm not giving his full name to protect the innocent, but just because I guess I'm a decent human, which is really hard to say about him as I look back. And allow me to explain at this point something about myself. I was definitely continuing to suffer from obsessive compulsive disorder, although still not knowing what I had, what caused me to have a nervous breakdown as a child, what caused me to just do some, as you can tell, really bizarre things so far in life. But the way I looked at men, I looked at it like, okay, I marry my mother, but I have affairs with my father. Now, truth be told, I've only been married once so far. And that was with someone like my mother who provided for me financially, but was emotionally just a child, except in my ex-husband's case, almost retarded emotionally. And had affairs with my father. And the men that I had affairs with were not, rapists or axe murderers, but they were not what I would call great people either. My father was probably a better human being than most of them, but they were brilliant. The mother and father figure to me were both brilliant, especially the father, but were very distant or even, again, retarded emotionally. Or, in this person's case, Stephen was definitely a sociopath. I have to admit I flirted outrageously with him. I don't know exactly when it happened because he was a pretty good teacher, and he was a scene study teacher. And that was just one of his gigs. His big thing was producing and directing. At some point when I was in his acting class, he flirted back with me. Like I said, my OCD was still pretty much running rampantly. No medication, no diagnosis, even though, again, I will remind you that it is one of the 3 major mental illnesses in our country, probably the world. So at this point, I was living with Patrick, who, as it turns out, was a paranoid, schizophrenic alcoholic. So I guess you could say I kind of viewed Patrick as being married to him, although I wasn't. So he was kind of the mother figure, although I would say my real mother was nothing like a paranoid schizophrenic. But Patrick did provide for me financially at that point. Although I did make some money in the theater, I couldn't have had the lifestyle that we had there from my money that I earned as an actor. So I was living with Patrick, and also back then I really didn't like nice guys very much. And I mention that because at that point I was also doing Bikram's hot yoga at least 4 or 5 times a week, and even more once I started also doing the instructor, Tony, I became even more of a regular. Tony was very smitten with me. I don't know why. I think Tony was of Mexican descent. He had a body to die for. He was a yoga master. I studied yoga for about 35 years and remained in the beginning class, which was hard as hell, and the temperature was 100 degrees for an hour and a half class. And the advanced class, there were very few people that did that. And really, to me, those people were contortionists. The things he could do with his body were just hard to believe. I will say one thing about this yoga, and now Bikram, I think, is being investigated for sexual, it's the Me Too movement, which I'm all for, sexually harassing young women. But at that time, he was really in vogue. And I will say that I learned a long time ago, and I may have already mentioned it, that art, good things can come from assholes. And his yoga was really, I've never, any other yoga I've ever done has never stood up to that hot yoga. And the deposits that I made into my yoga bank have held me in somewhat good stead, even to this day. It's definitely helped my posture, probably my life, my immune system, everything. And when I was seeing Tony, the instructor, I went at least 4 times a week. It's the most efficient way to get your body into shape. Yoga is a lot like Pilates, except it's just kind of backwards. I mean, you work the same muscles, but in different ways. But it was just an awesome workout. let's see, somewhere along the way, Tony and I went to Hawaii because Patrick was literally gone all the time. I would occasionally have Tony up to our condo when Patrick was out of town. Tony and I went with friends, a lady who's still my best friend who lived in Los Angeles, and she brought her boyfriend, and we went to Palm Springs together. And Tony was a really nice man, too nice for my tastes back then. He did do, which I found, he was so perfect in so many ways, and then I found that he occasionally did cocaine, and that I didn't like. Not to any great extent. I didn't do it. And then I remember one night, somehow, he gave me a niacin tablet, and it's some kind of vitamin B, but I felt like, oh my God, maybe we were smoking some marijuana also. I don't know, but my whole body was suddenly on fire. And I remember he thought it was funny because he didn't know that I didn't know what effect niacin could have on one. And this is funny because I guess about less than a year ago, in taking some type of vitamin B, I took a niacin, and oh my God, the same thing happened again. Had I not experienced that with Tony, like 25 years ago or so, I would have really gone to the emergency room. But I knew what had happened, and I knew that this too would pass. But it is really like you're just on fire, you have fever, you turn red all over. But anyway, bottom line, Tony was a nice guy. I was living with Patrick, but he was never there. And when he was there, he was beginning to act more and more crazy. For one thing, he drank all the time. He also did cocaine. Cocaine was really big back then. I tried it. I liked the high. I never liked marijuana. The first time I tried it, it was kind of unique. I think I mentioned that back in Dallas. But I never cared for weed. It tended to make me get into my head and, just get real cerebral and often depressed. Cocaine was different. It gave you a really big high, but coming down almost killed me every time. It just wasn't worth it for me because, and I'm sure it had something to do with my obsessive compulsive disorder and the serotonin and the chemicals in the brain, but it was just too high a price to pay to have to come down from it. Patrick also began telling me these stories of where he had been. Suddenly, the investment banker had become some type of spy working for not the CIA, but the NSA. And when he left, he would go on, so he said, he would go on some kind of military flights. And once he came back and said that he had been, and he really truly looked near death. He said he had been injected with something by a Russian agent. And, when I would repeat this to people, to friends of mine then, they would say, have you lost your mind? Because he certainly has. And yeah, when I did a reality check and mentioned this kind of thing to people, they and I knew that he was making all of this up, but he was so damn credible. He was one of the most credible psychotic people I've ever known. And since I was crazy myself then, I never liked being around other crazy people. It only made me feel crazier. And today, after a lot of work and now being a sane person, I still hold to that habit. No insanity, no drama except professionally, and no cruelty in my life now and forever. Thank you very much. God, please let me get through with this portion of sharing my life because it is anything but pleasant. Amen. So I began to see less and less of Tony. Patrick also, as it turned out, was not really a lover. I'm not sure we ever really had sex. He was more of a voyeur. Poor thing, he turned out to be a horror of a person. I really, looking back, think that Patrick was possibly trans because he definitely I think in many ways wanted to be a woman. He had all women friends. Once I came home in my apartment and found him with two other women, and they were putting makeup on him, and he was no doubt drunk or high or something, but it was like he was so happy. I've never seen him happier. And he was not a handsome man, and he was definitely not a handsome or a beautiful woman. But he had problems, and so did I. Okay, so at this point, I had started seeing my acting coach, Stephen, romantically. With Stephen, it was more just sexually because he was such a sociopath. And as I became more involved with him, I completely lost myself. And believe me, there wasn't much to lose at that point. I'm not going to say I'm proud of any of this, although I was ill. And Stephen and I wined and dined, and a lot of times we did it on Patrick's money. We took romantic vacations to Hawaii, Mexico, and Stephen had some money, but all I wanted to do was serve him. Sicko. In the meantime, Patrick had acquired that property in Cow Hollow. He did buy that condo, and he had also bought another condo in the Twin Peaks area of the city. And so I furnished that, and that's where I stayed most of the time. And most of the time, Stephen stayed there with me. Patrick just rarely, if ever, came over there. I think he liked it that he was still smitten with me, but he liked it that I had kind of my own place now. Although I still considered the condo at Cow Hollow mine as well, although it really legally wasn't. For a few years, he never even knew about Stephen. I guess in his own madness, it never occurred to him that I had sexual urges, since we definitely never had sex, or he never thought about it, or he didn't care. Patrick, I found out from a friend, found this out a few years ago, did die, and I did not really see how he could have lived much longer. He drank so much that you could actually smell the alcohol on his coming out of his pores. He drank vodka, so the only way you could smell it was when it came not from his breath, but when it just came out of his body. That's probably what eventually killed him. That and maybe the combination of cocaine or any other drug he may have done. Patrick loved San Francisco. That was the, I think, true love of his life. So it was no surprise to me that he died there. Getting back to my sick relationship with Stephen, I did continue to see him and just was really messed up at that point, mentally and emotionally. I remember one day I came to his downtown office in San Francisco dressed only in a raincoat. I must have seen this in a movie. I remember I hurriedly closed his office door where he was in his office and exposed myself to him, and he was so delighted, and we had sex on his large desk. And since he loved it so much, I was naturally pleased. In some fucked up way, this had something to do with trying to please my, I truly believe, absentee father, who by this time was long dead. This was truly sick. And then there was the time that he talked me into having what he called menage a trois with an attractive female actor he knew, but I did not. We met at my condo in Twin Peaks in San Francisco, but in reality, that was no menage a trois because I never once touched the woman. Yet he definitely dipped into both our pots, euphemistically speaking. Embarrassingly, I remember the real sadness for me was that he ended up coming inside of her and not me. Oh my God. I also remember that through his insistence before this happened, I shamefully even tried to lure one of my sweet actress friends, whom we both knew, into joining us for a menage a trois. And thank God she declined. And I did hear from Stephen later that She thought we were trying to set her up. She wasn't wrong. I was not a good person then, an understatement, mental illness or no, and deep down I knew that I had to leave both of these wacko men. But before that happened, at Stephen's urging, because he knew Patrick had money, at least more money than him, and he very much wanted to get a project off the ground that he had written. Patrick did know that I was studying acting with Stephen, and Steve did need to fund a film project that he wanted to do about the Dan White saga in San Francisco. If some of you may recall, when Dan White, who was a city representative, he murdered both the San Francisco mayor at the time and also Harvey Milk, who I believe was the first gay politically elected official in the country. This was a huge story. Stephen had written a screenplay about it. So I was to take them out together to meet and talk about that, and to see basically if Patrick would fund it. And I remember we went to this restaurant called the Cadillac Bar and Grill. It was a very upscale and popular Mexican restaurant, very happening at that time in San Francisco. This was so unpleasant to me that I just decided to become very drunk. And for whatever specific reason, Patrick soon after caught on to mine and Stephen's shenanigans, and he reneged on even the thought of funding Stephen's project. If in fact he actually, could have. He was becoming so paranoid and schizophrenic. Then it got even worse when Patrick figured out that I had allowed Stephen to steal Patrick's copier from our Upper Castro property, where we were now spending some time, which sociopath Stephen said was revenge for Patrick's fucking up his investment project. So as sick as I was, I finally picked up the phone and I called Patrick's parents in Albuquerque. He had actually taken me there once before, and they were, nice people. But I called to tell them that he appeared to be dying. I mean, no lie, GI. I think he was really dying of alcohol, but according to him, he was dying from, some kind of spy work. He had been injected with something. At any rate, he could no longer work. He was drunk all day, every day with vodka. And I shared that I believed he was having a full-out psychotic breakdown with all of his hallucinations about his involvement with the NSA and Russian intelligence. And Patrick drank so much. I may have mentioned this. Excuse me if I have. But he drank so much vodka, which, of course, you can't smell that on a person's breath, but his pores reeked of alcohol. I knew I had to leave immediately or go down with the ship, and I looked for his parents to, at least come get him. But instead, to my surprise, they responded with little or no emotion or even comment. Looking back, probably long ago they had reached their limit with Patrick. I'm sure he probably went through phases with his psychotic behavior, much like I did with my OCD, different but similar in that, I had the break when I was 10 years old, and I had it again when I was about 22 and married. But that was the final straw for me. I left Patrick, and I want to say one more thing about San Francisco. I spent a decade there. I was there from all of the 80s. And I guess I was with Patrick for about maybe 5 years. Doesn't seem possible. And was with Stephen the sociopath even longer. But during that time, I also did some good theater work. I did Beth Henley's The Miss Firecracker contest. I did a play that was basically a montage of monologues of different women characters called Talking With. I did probably at least 10 plays in San Francisco. And one of the sweetest, most authentic people I met doing theater there was Kate Mailer, who, as it turned out, was Norman Mailer's daughter. I did the Miss Firecracker contest with her. She was an absolute delight as a human being and a talented actress. I did see her on one TV movie years ago. She was playing a love interest of Joe Kennedy before the Joe Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's brother that died. She really broke the mold. She was really beautiful in her own way. Her mother was at one time married to Norman Mailer. This was not the one. I think he was married, 6 times? Final person he was married to, he ended up being married to a long time, and I think he died while they were married. But her mother was, I don't know if she was British royalty, but she was very high-end British. But I met her. She came to our show, and she just looked like middle-aged hippie. She was so kind, and there was nothing pretentious about her. She had taught Kate well. I think Kate spent some time with her father naturally, and in fact, her father was in town while we were doing the play because he was shooting some horrible movie. I can't even remember the name of it that he did, and I think Ryan O'Neal was in it. As a result, I got to meet Norman Mailer. Woo. He was so full of himself. And she really wanted me to meet his wife. I'm trying to think of his wife's name. But the reason she wanted me to meet her was because she was from Arkansas. And Norman Mailer had met her in Arkansas. And I read her memoir some years ago, and it was called, I believe, A Ticket to the Circus, primarily about her life with Norman Mailer. It was quite good. But getting back to Kate's real mother, that was her stepmother. This woman had a very exciting life. After she divorced Norman, or maybe even before, I believe she had an affair with Fidel Castro, Khrushchev. I don't know who would want to have an affair with Khrushchev. But she lived a very rather exotic, shall we say, infamous lifestyle. But by the time I met her, she had certainly settled down. And one thing that she and Kate did while she was in San Francisco was to go to soup kitchens and make sure that they fed the homeless. I don't know what has happened to Kate. She's about maybe not quite a decade younger than me, but she could have been, in fact, while we were doing the Miss Firecracker contest, I remember she was on the cover of Vogue magazine, and they mentioned that she was in a play in San Francisco and her father was in town, but she could have probably been a star, but she had other interests. She wasn't driven by any competition, but was extremely talented and another soul to remember. And I'm sure she's alive and well somewhere. I imagine it's probably in New York or Europe, or both. I loved her, and I'm sorry I lost contact with her as well. After I left Patrick, I got a job at a well-known trade show, and of course I had an affair with the owner. That was me at the time. Interestingly, I also did a cabaret in which I performed my original songs, not only country songs, but some songs that I had written during that period that were not country, and also some published songs. And I called that cabaret, which was at a club in San Francisco then called Rags, and a friend of mine named Ken directed it. And I had a couple of male gay friends then, and they also helped get me dressed and the makeup and all that. It was called Intuitively Deb. And, the name of this podcast is Authentically Debz. And, so that had something to do with my choosing the name for this podcast. But this show was interesting, and I wish I still had the old what do you call it? Not beta. Well, there was beta, and then there was VHS. Yeah, I wish I still had that. I don't think I do. The show was a success. There was 2 sets in the show, and for one set, I wore a dress that I had bought specifically for the show. It was a beautiful dress, and I have very small breasts, boobs, and so I had to have the dress taken up so that it would not reveal my breasts if I moved around in it, although there was not much to reveal, let's face it. I had nice breasts. In fact, I love my breasts now better than ever. They are just the right size. They've always been too small, but now it's perfect. I'm so glad I never had a boob job. But at that time, once the dress was altered in that way, I didn't try it on again until the night of the show. The second set, I changed into a real cute little jumpsuit kind of a thing with spaghetti straps. But during the first set, what happened was that I began falling in and out of that dress. And this is the first time that I noticed that, well, that's not necessarily true because the show was directed by a director friend of mine. And I was aware that there would be banter between the songs. The verbal banter was what was so funny and what really made the show wonderful. I mean, I think I performed the songs well. My voice was still in shape, but I loved the banter. And when I began coming in and out of that dress, I either had to stop the show because this was a club that held only about 100 people, and it was pretty packed. So I either had to stop the show or somehow work with it. And so I used it, and I used my banter in between songs. And I remember someone, probably a friend, but someone from the audience said, "You wear it well." That was just the most hysterically funny thing. And I will say that with a lot of help from my friends, I looked so beautiful that night. I was absolutely gorgeous, and the show was a success, even with the faux pas of that dress, what happened. So as soon as the first set was over, I changed into the other outfit, which was pants. Like I say, it was a really cute little sexy jumpsuit. And we finished. That was kind of like my experience in San Francisco in a nutshell. It was the agony and the ecstasy kind of simultaneously, much more so even than New York. You know, I guess we take our baggage with us. And ironically, San Francisco was the most spiritual place on earth I had ever lived. In fact, I guess you could call it the beginning of my spiritual quest was there. And I belonged to a then very state-of-the-art group in Marin County, which was just across the Golden Gate Bridge. By the way, Marin County was at least 10 degrees warmer than San Francisco. So I always loved going over there. And this was the only reason I had a little sanity to take with me when I finally left San Francisco, because I became very involved with my spiritual life for the first time. After 2 abortions and numerous other sordid adventures with Stephen, I steadily and rapidly grew away from him too. And I guess this is a small U-turn, but I remember the evening, and Patrick was away, and Stephen and I had gone to some kind of psychedelic movie. It was our first date. We came back to our condo in Cow Hollow, and you could tell that we were going to have sex that night, or we were definitely on our way. And he did say to me, he gave me a choice. He said, you know, this is going to change everything. And he was certainly correct about that. I wish I had thought about more of what he said and had declined, but no, Nanette. So I was really trying to leave San Francisco. And let me also mention in San Francisco that they had many more small earthquakes than I experienced in Los Angeles, you know, the short time I had lived there, and even the long time I've lived here. In San Francisco, you could just feel, at least in the 80s, you could feel these earthquakes. They weren't big at all, but you could feel them. And I remember in the trade show where I worked, I said, hey, we're having an earthquake. Wasn't that an earthquake? And people looked at me like, yeah, so what? And so it was a real common thing, and especially locals just thought nothing of it. The last summer I lived in San Francisco, I think it was the summer of '89. I was alone in the middle of the night in a new apartment complex that I had moved into. It was definitely up to code, earthquake-wise, thank God. And it was a one-bedroom apartment, and the earthquake was only a 6-pointer, but that was pretty big. All earthquakes are different, I have found, having experienced a few by this time in my life. But that one felt and sounded like someone or something was crushing my building, and specifically my bedroom. It really felt like a bulldozer was taking my bedroom and crunching it together into some kind of little piece, or maybe several pieces. So for a few moments, I really believed I was going to die alone right there. So I ran to my window, which overlooked a beautiful courtyard in this new high-rise I had moved into, and I stuck my head out the window, along with seeing a few other poor souls who didn't want to die alone either. But that was it for me in San Francisco. That was the straw that broke the proverbial camel's back. I had had enough. So when my ex-husband in Arkansas called me and almost begged me to come back to Arkansas and help him manage my older, troubled daughter, I gladly acquiesced. But it was a very, very difficult place to leave. And one other thing about San Francisco, which I may have mentioned, apologies if so, but when I was in San Francisco, I found that everyone there hated Los Angeles except me. And then on the other hand, having lived down here for many years now in Los Angeles, we do not give San Francisco a thought. But I don't know if they still do, but they thought about us a lot back then, and they made fun of us. They thought we were so shallow, and all I knew was that I had to get out of San Francisco. In addition to my problems with men, the spirituality of the community just really cut you to the heart. And unless you were on the right side of it, which I was getting to be just before I left, it really could be extremely agonizing. So I'm off to Arkansas. Hey everyone, thanks for listening to Authentically Debz. And if you like my show, please subscribe, leave a review, and definitely tell a friend. Oh, and make sure to visit my website where you can keep up with my current projects, learn a little more about me, and follow my latest news. And that website is www.deborahjangray.com. The spelling is Debora, no H, Jangray. And most importantly, blessings to everyone.